said, today's presentation is called 10 Ways to Make Your Process Smarter with Metadata. It's another one of our top 10 series of webinars. And as you can see, this one's about metadata. My name is Joe Spadola. I'm an applications engineer for HPM nCode, and I am based on the West Coast. So thanks for attending today. So before we get started, it's probably a wise question to ask what exactly metadata is. Since this is a top 10 ways to make it smarter with metadata, let's first define exactly what metadata is. Metadata is nothing more than data about the data. So if you think of a time series file, it's a squiggly line that goes on through time. Well, those raw data points are the actual data itself, but things about that data, interesting pieces of information about that data, such as the max, the min, the mean, the channel title, these are all what we call metadata. So it's information about the raw data. And it's useful for us to consider and to look at for a number of reasons, and we'll see 10 examples of that today. The reason that metadata exists is so that we can make our processes more robust and easier to use. And the way that we do that, or one way that we can do that, is by using metadata as Glyph properties. You can see here I have a screenshot of the arithmetic Glyph. Okay, and if you were to pop that Glyph onto your workspace and open up the properties, you would see that one of the properties that you need to enter in there is called the constant. So this is the value that you would be operating on all of your data with. Okay, as you can see right here, you can hard code a value in, and that would be 0. Okay, so it would, in this case, it would subtract 0. Okay, it's kind of pointless, but it would be subtract any constant from all of your data. Okay, alternatively, you can use metadata as that value right there. Okay, and what that does is that it allows dynamic updating of properties on a per channel or per test basis. So you can see down in this bottom screenshot here, I have metadata. Okay, in this case, I'm looking at the mean, and I'm using that as my constant. So what this means is that as I run this process, the mean value of each channel, in this case, is going to be subtracted from itself. Okay, so this is, again, this property here, this constant, is going to depend on the channel because we're looking at each channel's metadata to do that calculation. Okay, and metadata is referred to, you can see it down here, it's surrounded by these pound signs here. Metadata is some string, some series of characters surrounded by these pound signs. Okay, and what's inside of these is can be any number of things, and we'll see a bunch of examples as we go along. Okay, so in a nutshell, that is metadata. So why is that important? Well, in the previous slide, I just showed you an example of using GlyphWorks. You can open up the arithmetic Glyph, you can type in a constant, and you can go forward with your calculation, your process. But understanding and leveraging metadata is the next step to creating robust and widely applicable processes that can dynamically update those properties. Okay, then just like the previous example where I showed you the constant in the arithmetic Glyph will change if you use metadata in the way that I showed you. Okay, it also allows you to automate a data analysis process, and most importantly, it's the start to becoming a power user. Okay, if you have ever picked up a process that someone else at your company has used or created and dug around in the properties and found these properties that have pound signs or words surrounded by pound signs, okay, what they've done is they've created a very powerful process by using this metadata, by leveraging this concept of metadata. Okay, so we're going to look at 10 examples of that today. So let's look at the list. Here are the 10 ways that we're going to make our processes smarter with metadata. First, we're going to do something very simple. We're just going to view results as metadata. Okay. Then we're going to update channel titles. We're going to create new metadata with something called the metadata calculator. Then we're going to figure out how we can get metadata into our process from in this case we're looking at from Excel. So if we have a list of information or useful bits of information that we want to assign to our data in GlyphWorks, we can grab that from Excel, and we'll see how to do that. We will learn how to create reference lines from metadata. Okay, so this is creating reference lines on display plots. We will use something called the metadata generator to get user input to a process. We will use metadata to select channels for analysis. So this is for those familiar out there, this would be used in the test splitter. Okay, and this is a very, very powerful way of using metadata. We will learn how to assign custom limits on displays. So how can you adjust the X limits and the Y limits on displays through metadata? We will then look at a more advanced use case of metadata. This would be what we call schedule summation with repeats as metadata. Okay, a lot of words right now. We'll see what that means in a minute. And then we'll finish up tip number 10 with recognizing channels via metadata. Okay, so let's just get started here. Let's see a simple case. Tip number 1, viewing results as metadata. If you haven't before used the metadata display, this is the easiest way to quickly view all of the metadata that is contained within tests and channels. As you can see, this simple process here contains some input. It contains, in this case, a strain life fatigue calculation, and then it contains a metadata display. Okay, and what we'll see is that certain items of metadata, like this called attributes, okay, are calculated automatically. Other metadata, like you can see here, strain life 1 underscore properties, strain life 1 underscore results, these are added by Glyph. So as you go through a process, as your data flows through a process or a series of glyphs, certain glyphs, in this case the strain life glyph here, will add metadata to the data stream so that you can use that or view that downstream. Okay. Speaking of the metadata display, you can also look at it in a number of ways. One is the list view that you can see right here, and another is a custom table view that you can see right here. And then you can do a number of powerful things just with this table itself as well. So I'm going to go into GlyphWorks real quick and explain this in a little more detail. Okay, so I've got GlyphWorks open. I'm going to launch the program. Okay, and I've already created that process that I just showed you, so I'm just going to open that up real quick. So here's my existing process. I'm going to drag in a time series file, in this case, just a series of strain gauge channels. Okay, and I can see that data right there. I'm going to do a strain life calculation on those strain gauge channels. And the strain life glyph pumps out a whole bunch of information. As you can see, you'll get a damage time series out of it, damage histograms, rainflow histograms, all sorts of information that helps you assess the fatigue characteristics of the data you've entered. There's a green output pad here called fatigue results. Okay, and these are results that are stored as metadata. So if I just run this process, okay, I can see I have this table already created for me. Real quick, I'm going to put a brand new metadata display on there just so that we can see the list view first. So this is a list view of the metadata contained in my original data and the data that came, or the metadata that was generated by the strain life glyph. So I can see I have two levels of metadata. One is called test level metadata. Okay, and under the test level, you'll have a series of attributes. In this case, this only contains the number of channels. You will also have something called input test info. This contains information about the data file itself, specifically the extension, where this data is coming from, the name of the test, etc. Typically, people look at as much, if not more, channel level metadata. So I'm going to look at some of that here. If I open the, for example, channel 90, I can see I have a bunch of different, these are what we call sets of metadata. Okay, so we have a set of attributes associated with channel 90. We have a set of extra details associated with channel 90, a set of input test info, and then a set of different results that, again, these were generated for me by the strain life glyph. Okay, so there's kind of a couple concepts that we're understanding here. One, there's test level metadata, okay, and then there's channel level metadata. And under each level of metadata, we have a number of different, at this level, they're called sets. Okay, so we have a set of attributes. If we open up the set, we see a whole bunch of what we call different items. Okay, and these are items of metadata. Items such as, under the attributes set, we have channel title, okay, the channel number, like I said earlier, the min, mean, and max, some basic statistics. You can see we've got even standard deviation and RMS value of this data, as well as sample rate, Y title, Y units, etc. So, like I said, all this is very interesting and useful data about the original data. Okay, so it's not the raw data itself, it's not the squiggly lines. These are bits of information that describe the original data, but aren't the raw, actual original data. Okay, now each channel has its own group of sets, and they're always going to be the same. Well, not necessarily, but most of the time they're the same. So I can go look at, I just looked at channel 90, I can go look at channel 91 as well. Okay, and this will have its own set of metadata. So if I look at the attributes here, I can see this contains different metadata because we have a different channel number, we have a different channel title, and then consequently, because it's different data, we're going to have different mean, min, max values, different statistics as well. Okay, we can, like I said, you can create a table view of that, and I've done that here for you already. I've selected which bits of metadata I want to look at. In this case, since I did a fatigue analysis, I want to know channel number, channel title, the max value in the channel, the min value in the channel, and then the life. Okay, so I did a fatigue analysis. I want to know how long that part is going to last, until how long until a crack is predicted to initiate at that strain gauge location. Okay, so I've got this information here. The interesting thing about, or an interesting thing about the metadata display is that I can actually create custom results in here as well, based on other results, based on this metadata. Okay, so if I go into the properties of this glyph, I can see what items are displayed in my table. Okay, what items are displayed in my tabular results there. Each of these are referring to a specific piece of metadata. Okay, and you can see it distinguishes it by the set. So this is the attributes and then the item. Okay, so if I wanted to create my own piece of, or my own result here, I can add my own row, and then I can actually type in this case, I'm going to type in an equation. Say for some reason I want to, I need to know the range, the range of each channel. Okay, so the max value minus the min value in each channel. I can add that quite simply by just referring to those pieces of metadata. So the max value minus the min value. Okay, that's going to give me this range that I'm looking for. So under the title, I can then type in range or strain range. Okay, so I've entered an equation based on metadata. Again, metadata are those values surrounded by the pound signs. Okay, and then the title I just typed in there. So now if I hit OK, I can see now I have a new column in there that I just created based on existing metadata. Okay. So again, the takeaway from this example here, there are levels of metadata. We've got test level metadata, and we've got channel level metadata, and then we have under each level we have sets, and then under each set we have items. Okay, so that's kind of the hierarchy of how metadata exists in GlyphWorks. Okay, so I'm going to jump back to the presentation now. Okay, so that's viewing results as metadata. Tip number 2, updating channel titles. This is an easy way to, for example, overwrite mislabeled attribute level metadata. So let's say for some reason, when I was setting up my data acquisition box, I incorrectly typed in the name of a channel or something like that. I can use a tool that we have called a metadata calculator to actually overwrite that mislabeled channel title. Okay, and the way you do that is by telling GlyphWorks what set it belongs to. Okay, and then what the item under that set is. So if you remember, we looked a minute ago at the list of metadata. Okay, under that list there was a set called attributes. So under each channel there's a set called attributes, and then under that set there's an item called channel title or chan title. Okay, and that's referring to the channel title for that that particular channel. Okay, and then I am going to be overwriting it. So all I do then is enter the correct value or whatever string I want or whatever channel title I want into this box right here. Okay, so as data passes through this metadata calculator, it will overwrite the channel that I selected, in this case channel 90. It'll overwrite the original channel title with this new channel title that I have there. Okay, so that's a way of editing existing metadata. Okay, we can use that exact same glyph and this same concept to not only edit metadata but also create new metadata. Okay, so this again is the metadata calculator. And in the previous example, we looked at how we can modify existing data. And in this case, we're looking at how we can create new data, new metadata. So, for example, here, say we want to, if you remember in the example I did live just a minute ago, I wanted to see the range of each channel. So I looked at that and just created an inline equation in my metadata display table. Well, if I need that value, if I want to be able to calculate that value or use that calculated value somewhere downstream in my process, I can do that. I can create that piece of metadata and then store it with or insert it into the data stream so that I can use that downstream. Okay, and again, the idea behind using metadata is you know, I mean, there are a number of reasons why. First, we might have to fix a problem that already existed in the data. So in the previous example, we looked at renaming a channel. We can also use metadata to insert information for downstream purposes. Okay, for example, right here, if I need to use this range for some calculation downstream, I'm going to create this piece of metadata and then insert it into the data stream. Okay, so using this value or using this calculated value downstream. And then also, metadata is useful for inserting new information into the flow for traceability purposes or for reporting purposes. In this example here, I can also insert a piece of metadata called test location. Okay, in the test location, then you can enter any information that you want. So if you need to, you know, on your report specify at what proving ground your test was performed at. You can very easily create that test location metadata with the metadata calculator, enter in the value, in this case desert proving ground, and then refer to that piece of metadata later on in your flow or in your report. Okay. So metadata useful for fixing existing problems, overriding existing problems, inserting new information, or calculating new pieces of metadata. Okay, range, for example, that you want to use downstream, or inserting other information that needs to be used downstream for calculations, for traceability, for reporting purposes, etc. Excuse me. Tip 4, getting metadata from the Excel input glyph. This is pretty useful. What we can do here is actually take an actual Excel spreadsheet, so an XLS file, bring it into our workspace. You can see we have it input right here, okay, an Excel input, and then assign metadata to various channels. Okay, so when we run this process, what GlyphWorks is going to do is it's going to scan through this list here. In this case, I'm doing channel level metadata. It's going to scan through this list here, look for each of the channels, and any channel it finds with this number, it's going to assign any metadata that it sees over on the right, or any values that it finds over here, to this piece of metadata. So channel 90 will have after we run this flow, we'll have a new piece of metadata called material, and the material will be the value associated with this cell right here. Okay, it will also have a new piece of metadata called KF. KF is just a fatigue strength reduction factor. So in this case, what we're doing is inserting a bunch of fatigue-specific properties that will be used in a downstream calculation. Okay, so at this point, we're grabbing data from Excel. We're assigning metadata to the original data. Okay, and then when we're in this glyph here, this strain life glyph, this fatigue calculation glyph, we can refer to the metadata that we just created upstream of that. Okay, so now in here, if we, in this example here, we have we're assigning this KF, this fatigue strength reduction factor value, to each channel. So now in the strain life glyph, instead of just entering a hard value for KF, we can enter a channel specific value, okay, because we got that from this Excel file here. Okay. Similarly, we can use the offset value or the material and have all of this newly created metadata drive the properties of the calculation glyphs downstream. Okay, so Excel, this is a useful way to get a series of metadata in. Okay, and you can do this on the test level as well. So imagine instead of having channels here, you have a whole bunch of test names. Okay, and then if you have a bunch of test names here, as you drop in a whole bunch of tests to your input glyph, GlyphWorks will look through this list here, and instead of looking for channels, it will look for actual tests, and then it will assign this metadata on the test level instead of the channel level. Okay, and I have an example of that later that we will actually see. Okay, so that's how we can use Excel to get metadata. Number 5, creating reference lines from metadata. If you've ever put a reference line on an XY display, you might be familiar with going into the display properties of your XY display, clicking on reference lines, and then typing in the line definition right here. Okay, and the line definition is a series of XY points separated by colons. You can literally enter that value, or enter that string, that XY point separated by colons, into this line definition property box right here. Okay, or you can create a string of metadata that defines that line. That is a series of XY points separated by colons, Okay, and you can create that metadata upstream somewhere in a metadata generator, in Excel, through a metadata calculator. Okay, you can create that definition or that string, that piece of metadata anywhere upstream. And then when you get to the display glyph, all you simply have to do is enter that metadata item into your line definition. Okay, and then what GlyphWorks is going to do is it's going to say, okay, I see this piece of, it's referring to this metadata here, so all I'm going to go do is grab the, whatever that string that represents, whatever is defined in this max ref line metadata item, and insert it into this property box here. Okay, the result would be then, the definition of the line I created previously, or somewhere upstream of the display glyph here. Okay. So that's how we would, that's one example of creating reference lines for metadata. Number 6, using the metadata generator as user input. Okay, again, all of this whole concept of creating metadata, of editing metadata, of modifying metadata, we're doing all this because we want to make our downstream calculations easier. We want to make anybody who uses this process, we want them to have an easier time of going about changing properties. So one thing that we can do with the metadata generator is use it kind of as an input box for the user. Okay, so say we've got a series of downstream glyphs, or a series of calculation glyphs, or maybe a studio display with some reporting information. If we need to gather all of that information, but it's spread out a bunch of different glyphs, like say we need a piece of metadata that's used in a calculator, a piece of metadata that's used in the XY display, rather than having the user have to open up all of those boxes, all of those glyphs, edit the properties, close the property, go back to another glyph, enter a different property in there, we can actually use this metadata generator as our input. So then we can prompt the user or have the user enter in this information here all in one place. Okay, so for example, enter in the rolling radius. This value might be used in the time series calculator. Enter in the test engineer. Okay, obviously this isn't going to be used in a time series calculator, so this might be used somewhere else, like in the in a studio report, so that we can establish accountability to that test, or traceability at least. Okay. So you can imagine how many different items you can have in here, right? You can have properties such as even the window type of an FFT calculation or something. Okay, the limit of properties that you can have in here is pretty much limitless. Okay. Number 7, using metadata to select channels for analysis. This is an extremely powerful tool, and if you've ever taken a GlyphWorks training class, this is definitely an example that you do in class quite early on. The concept here is we have a series of input data. In this case, we're looking at something that contains speed channels and strain gauge channels and force transducers and temperature gauges and GPS data, a plethora of information. Okay, if we only want to do a fatigue calculation, we would have to ordinarily go in and pick out which channels are strain gauge channels. Okay, which are the channels that contain strains. Those are the only ones that we want to do our calculation on. So you can go pick those out individually and create a process that does that, or you can be a little bit smarter about it and take advantage of metadata. Okay, one of the items that I mentioned earlier that is contained in the attribute level of metadata is called Y units. Okay, you can see it right down here. So Y units. This is the unit attached to the Y-axis of your data. Okay, and what we can do is tell GlyphWorks to look through every single channel and only pick for me, or only select channels that contain the word strain in their Y unit. Okay, so this is going to only pick for me those strain gauge channels. Okay, no matter where they are in the list of channels, no matter how many there are, how few there are, it's only going to find the strain gauge channels for me. Okay, I'm going to do a live example of this, so I'm going to go into the software real quick and kind of walk through this. So I'm going to open up another process. Okay, so this is the exact same process that I had, but in the previous example, I had a test that contained only strain gauge channels, so I could feed all of them directly to my strain-life glyph. In this example, I'm going to use a test that contains all sorts of different information. You can see I've got 21 channels here of, speed channel, break on or off. Here's some strain gauges. Here's some load cells. Here's some more strain gauges, some more loads, more strain gauges. Okay, so a bunch of channels kind of spread out through this entire test. So I'm going to bring this test into my workspace. Okay, I can see that there. Now, like I said, I'm going to do a strain life calculation. Okay, it doesn't make any sense to do strain life calculation on speed or on break logic channel, right? So I want to use this test splitter to only get for me, or to only choose for me, the strain gauge channels. So I'm going to go to the properties of this glyph. And now I'm going to allow the test splitter to do that selection of data for me. Okay, so under item, this is where you'll enter the piece of metadata that we want to refer to. Okay, and I can choose this metadata a number of ways. I can type it in. If you know the metadata item name by heart, you can type that in, or you'll see anytime there's a section that you can pick metadata or that you can enter metadata into, you're always going to find a pick button. And if you click pick, it will bring up what is a familiar looking list that we saw earlier of metadata or available metadata variables or items for you to choose from. So again, I want to look at the Y units. I know that the Y units are, it's at channel level, right? Because each channel is going to have a different set of, or a different Y unit associated with it. So I'm going to expand my channel level metadata. And then I know that the Y units are contained within the attributes set. So I'm going to expand that as well. Make this a little bit bigger. And now I can see all of my attributes associated with each channel. And I was, the point of this exercise right here is to have GlyphWorks look through the Y units of every single channel and select for me only the ones that contain strain. What I'm doing right now is simply picking the metadata item that I want GlyphWorks to look at. So I want us to look at Y units. The fact that the Y units of channel 1 or miles per hour is irrelevant at this point. All I want to do is select the metadata item that I'm interested in. In this case, it's Y units. Okay, so I'm going to select that. I'm going to hit OK, and then it inserts in the properties box there that value that I just selected. So I've got attributes Y units. Okay, so that's the metadata item I want to use in this comparison that I'm doing. The comparison operator, this just means what method you want to compare this value that you're going to enter to the item that you're currently looking at. Okay, and in this case, I'm going to, well, you can see there's a number of logical operators in here. I'm just going to push equals or click the equals. So I want to know when my metadata Y unit value is equal to the string micro strain. Okay, and I can see over here that this is the Y unit I have tagged to any channel that has micro strain, or that is a strain gauge channel. So what's going to happen here when I run the process, all of the channels are going to go through this test splitter. GlyphWorks is going to interrogate each specific channel's Y unit metadata, and it's only going to select for me ones that contain this value here in its Y unit metadata. Okay, so if I hit OK and I run the flow, now I can see here's the exact same list that I looked at earlier. So it's a list of channel numbers, channel titles, max, min, and life. Okay, and I have 11 channels here that it has picked out for me. So you can see GlyphWorks did a good job of selecting only the string gauge channels. I put in here 21 channels, okay, and you can see obviously not all 21 of those are strain gauges. So it only picked out for me the 10 or 11 that do contain strain gauge information. Okay, so the test splitter is a very powerful tool, and it is used quite widely in GlyphWorks. And it's a perfect example as a glyph that is extremely powerful with the use of metadata. Okay, so jump back to the presentation. That was example or tip number 7, how to intelligently select channels for analysis. Okay, tip number 8, custom limits on displays. This allows you to set the y-axis or the y limits and the x limits on any downstream display. Okay, so the first thing that you have to do is create a channel level set of metadata called custom limits. Okay, so this is telling GlyphWorks that I'm going to have a custom limit set of metadata. Okay, and then under that custom limit set of metadata, I'm going to have the y max and the y min values. So under the set, I've got 2 items. In this case, I'm only modifying or only indicating what I want the y limits to be. You can also have custom x max and custom x min in there as well, if you wanted to, zoom in on some portion of the data as well. Right now, I'm only interested in setting these custom values for the y-axis. Okay, so somewhere upstream, I created this data. You can do that again with the metadata generator or the metadata calculator. Okay, there are a number of different ways. The point is you need to create this metadata somewhere upstream. Okay, and then I hard coded these values in there. So 5 and -5. Okay. Then I go to my XY display. Okay, and when you highlight your XY display in the toolbar, the second button from the left. Okay, if you're familiar with XY displays, the button on the far left, this this white box with the arrows pointing in every direction, that's the max view, so that fits all the data to your screen. The button just to the right of that allows you to choose what scale you're using for that data. Okay, there's full scale, that's the default value. That will assign the y max to the maximum value in your channel, and the y min to the minimum value in your channel. Okay, and so each channel will have its own y max and y min. Okay. If you go to global y will set this value based on the maximum from all your channels, and this value based on the minimum from all your channels. So this is a good way. Global y would be a good way to look at all of your channels on the exact same scale. And that same scale would be dictated by the max in all your channels and the min in all your channels. If you want to specify exactly what the max and mins are, we can change this option here to metadata. Okay, so if we change the limits option to metadata, then what GlyphWorks is going to do is when it has an XY display, it's going to look in my channel level metadata for a set called custom limits, and then any items contained under that, custom Y max, custom Y min, it will set these values associated with those items to the y-axis there. And again, if I had custom X min and custom X max, it would set these values down here for me as well. Okay, so 2 steps to this process. 1, upstream, I need to create this metadata. 2, I need to go to my display and turn on or change the limits option from full scale to metadata. Okay, and then the plot at that point will have my custom Y limits or custom X limits as well. Okay. So that's tip number 8, custom limits on displays. Tip number 9, this is schedule summation with repeats as metadata. Okay, so this one's a little bit more complicated. This is a bit of a busy slide, so I'm actually going to jump into the software and show you an example of this. To briefly kind of give an overview here, excuse me, what we're doing is taking input data, so multiple input tests. We are associating, or we're also inputting an Excel file. Okay, and the Excel file will contain a list of tests and then a number of repeats. Okay, so what GlyphWorks is going to do is look through this stack of tests that I dropped into my input glyph. It's going to scroll through this list here, this Excel list here, so this column of test names. Anytime it finds a test in the input glyph that matches this string right here, it's going to create a new piece of test level metadata called repeats, and then it's going to associate, and then it's going to assign this value here to that new piece of metadata, that new piece of test level metadata. Okay, so I have a number of inputs. I have an Excel file. I have test names in my Excel file with associated number of repeats. Okay, GlyphWorks is going to create this repeat metadata for me, and then as I go through this process, in fact, I'm just going to jump in there and show you right now. So I'm going to open a new process. Okay, so this is what we were just looking at, and again, I'm going to drop in my 2 input files. Okay, so I've got 2 string gauge tests, ATV12 and ATV13. I'm going to put those into my input display, or my time series input glyph, and then I need my Excel spreadsheet. So I've got an Excel file here. This contains my test repeat count. Okay, and I'm just going to drop that in there. And again, the Excel file looks like this. So I have my test name, and then a list of the tests, and then I have my repeats, and then how many repeats are associated with each of those tests. Okay. So if I run the process here, what it's going to do is, again, it's going to grab each test. It's going to assign it a piece of metadata. That metadata is going to be called repeats. Okay, and it's going to be on the test level. And then what I'm doing here is, this is just some, well, first of all, it's doing a rainflow count. Okay, so it's rainflow counting each channel. And then here I'm multiplying by the repeat. So I'm scaling the rainflow results by that repeat count that I have. Okay, so I'm creating a schedule without the schedule create app. I'm integrating my schedule create process, if you will, into my flow. Okay, and then you can see if I go to the properties of my arithmetic glyph here, here's that constant value. Okay, under constant, I'm using that new piece of metadata called repeats. Okay, so I'm letting Excel dictate which test has how many repeats. Okay, and I've entered that again into an Excel file and dragged it in here. Then I'm referring to that newly piece of created metadata to scale each of those rainflow results. Okay, and then what I'm doing here is taking each of those resulting histograms, so those scaled histograms, and I'm sending them to my second workspace here. Okay, and then the second workspace, this glyph here collects all of those tests. Okay, and then it combines all of them. So then if I run this flow, now I can see this is a rainflow histogram of all of my combined input data. Okay, so this is going to be rainflow results for all of the tests that I drop into my input glyph times the number of repeats for each of those tests. Okay, so this is my overall schedule rainflow count. Okay, jump back to the software. or the presentation and finish it up. Okay, so the last one, tip number 10, recognizing channels via metadata. This is useful if you have consistent channel titles, but inconsistent channel numbers. So let's say I know, or let's say, for example, I want to, for reporting purposes, I want to create some statistics that contain the maximum speed of the vehicle during testing and the average speed of the vehicle during testing. Okay, and then let's say, for example, I don't know which channel that is going to be. Okay, different tests require different instrumentation, and each time, you know, a different engineer sets it up, and he doesn't always put the same channel or the speed channel to the assign it the same channel number on each test. Okay, so I can't reliably build a process based strictly on channel number. Okay, because I can't say find the max of channel number 1 all the time and find the average of channel number 1 all the time and know that that's going to be my speed channel, because that isn't necessarily always my speed channel. So what I can do is use this metadata. Okay, and in this case, I'm referring to the I'm letting GlyphWorks pick a channel, or pick the channel that contains the name trans speed. Okay, whatever that means, trans speed. I know that every single test I'm going to do, even if the channel numbers aren't the same, my speed channel is going to have this title. It's going to have the title trans speed. Okay, so what GlyphWorks is going to do is it's going to scan through every single channel that I have. It's going to look at the channel title, and it's going to extract the metadata items I'm interested in from that particular channel. Okay, so then regardless of what channel number it is, I'm always going to get the max and average from the speed channel. Okay, so I can create this new metadata set called run stats, and these are stats that I'm interested in for reporting purposes downstream, and I, excuse me, I'm using the channel name to pick that out instead of the channel number. Okay, so top 10 tips. Those were 10 ways that you can make your process smarter with metadata. We looked at a simple case of viewing metadata as results. We looked at creating new metadata with a metadata calculator, getting metadata from Excel, creating these reference lines, using the metadata generator as a user input. Okay, using metadata to select channels for analysis. That was our example with the test splitter. We looked at creating custom limits on displays, updating channel titles. A more complicated example of creating a schedule in the flow itself with the repeats as metadata. And then we just looked at how to recognize channels via metadata. Okay, and again, metadata is data about data. Okay, it's useful for reporting purposes or doing some sort of calculation downstream on not necessarily the raw data, but data about that data. Okay, and once you can really harness this concept of metadata, the power of metadata, you can create extremely slick processes that can be used time and time again with different input sets. Different groups in your company can use them. It becomes a pretty widely applicable and robust process. Okay.